Welcome to this session. And our first presenter is going to be Samir Ravi. He's a trans independent scholar at Sacred Heart Prep in California. His research is on queer theory, intellectual history, and educational studies. They are an ardent advocate for critical race theory in K through 12. And she leads an initiative, Healing Literacies Project. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. And my presentation is entitled Slippery Relationality, Queer Buddhisms, and Liberatory Praxis. My presentation will not necessarily define sort of the closed or definitive argument, but instead present what you might think of as sketches or traces of ideas that have been sort of ruminating in my head for the past year or so. And broadly, I'm going to be looking at the ways in which queer of color practitioners of Buddhism, particularly in the US context, rework sort of the rubrics of humanism, relationality, and metaphysics that structure colonial modernity. So to begin my talk, I want to start with sort of a brief autoethnographic reflection on my own positionality. So I am born into a Hindu family. Currently, I'm 18 years old and I'm a practitioner of Hinduism. Although in the past year or so, I've sort of discovered resonances between my spiritual disposition and Buddhism. And so I've become more drawn to that spiritual tradition. It's not native to my family's geography, although I am a South Asian person, a diasporic South Asian person. And so there are certain geographic connections between Buddhism and my family roots. So in a sense, you could describe my taking up the tradition of Buddhism as a kind of migration, a migration from Hinduism, my sort of native self, to another kind of system of belief that I was not already a part of initially. But as sort of, I guess you could describe myself as a nascent practitioner of Buddhism in the sense that I'm not fully, I guess you could say, integrated into the tradition. I've sort of discovered a sangha or a community of practitioners who have been accepting of my sort of newness to the tradition. I've been sort of participating mostly in online collectives of Buddhist practitioners. Most of these are white dominated spaces. So it's kind of interesting to be presenting on queer of color practitioners specifically. Although there exist a variety of Buddhist groups or Buddhist sanghas, as they're called, that are dedicated to LGBT practitioners specifically. There's sort of a dearth of groups that focus specifically on the experiences of queer of color practitioners. And within this sort of collective, within sort of joining these collectives of practitioners, I've sort of discovered that Mikhail Bakhtin's theorization of heteroglossia, which is essentially the idea of multiplicity within a unity, is sort of helpful here, because in sort of in encountering the radical differences of the practitioners with whom I was communing, I discovered a basis for meaning and spiritual value for myself. And so my differences from the practitioners with whom I was engaging, for example, racial differences, that oftentimes I was the only person of color in those spaces, those didn't necessarily prevent me from deriving meaning from their experiences. And it was in fact through those experiences of othering, even though they were definitely racialized, that it was those experiences of being estranged from myself that allowed me to sort of access a kind of source of spiritual meaning. My presentation will sort of loosely address these three sort of strands of inquiry. I will ask how queer of color practitioners of Buddhism rework colonial socialities in as they operate in neoliberal contexts of racial capitalism. I'm going to be considering the kinds of alternative ontoepistemologies that queer of color engagement with Buddhism inaugurates. My research is centered sort of in critical theory. And so a lot of my experience in this field isn't from the perspective of religious studies directly, but sort of draws from a variety of interdisciplinary modes of knowing that guide my theorizations. And then this is not a question I'm going to be approaching sort of directly in my talk, but it will consider how we can reimagine the act of critique, how we can reimagine the presuppositions, affiliations, and commitments of hermeneutics in thinking with the decolonial imaginaries that my talk will encounter. I want to begin with sort of two quotes that will help ground my theorizing. The first one is from a Black Buddhist practitioner, Buddhism, he's a contemporary practitioner named Lama Rod Owens. And he writes in one of his books, when I'm able to walk in the door, embracing all aspects of my intersectional identity, while allowing myself the grace to teach through my identity, I'm transmitting a dharma from my experience of being at home in my body, where I'm least likely to reproduce psychic violence by offering dharma through a mind that denies and rejects vital parts of myself. So I see him as sort of continuing a tradition of identity politics, not as it's sort of been articulated in the mainstream culture wars, but really by the Combahee River Collective of Black feminists in the 1970s, who wrote in their statement that we realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. And so one of the reasons why I'm focusing on queer of color practitioners of Buddhism specifically is because they are overdetermined. They are marked by a surplus of nominatives, queer, Buddhist, diasporic, brown, at least that's for me. And so part of the ethical and also hermeneutical tension in this is how can we navigate that surplus of sort of semiotic nominatives in pursuing liberation? In other words, how can we reconcile the biological or the fleshed with the symbolic regimes of colonialism that continue to mark our bodies through insidious processes of violence, but also through processes of identification that can enable what Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak calls strategic essentialism, or identity politics, as Black feminisms have sort of taken it up since the late 20th century. I want to begin by thinking through concepts of anti-network theory in Rhizome that were formulated by a sort of panoply of continental philosophers. One of them is Bruno Latour, who is a sociology, or who described himself as sociology of science, and then Deleuze and Guattari, who themselves were psychoanalysts, but who also explored sort of the possibilities of relationality in their work. And I want to ground, or I want this to form a sort of theoretical context within which I can explicate the ways in which queer of color Buddhist practitioners stage sort of forms of relationality that work against, or not only work against, but really provide alternatives to the metaphysical imperatives of colonial modernity. So Bruno Latour writes that actor network theory, which is essentially a way of tracing through a social web associations between non-social and social actors. He writes that actor network theory, as it's abbreviated as ANT, is a powerful tool to destroy spheres and domains, to regain the sense of heterogeneity, and to bring interobjectivity back into the center of attention. And so the reason why I include his work on actor network theory here is because, as I sort of described earlier in my brief autoethnographic reflection, within the Sangha, I was sort of able to connect with people of different identities, and particularly white cis male practitioners. That's a kind of interesting dynamic because I myself am, you could describe as a person who possesses several minoritized identities, but I'm still able to learn through, to sort of suspend myself in the practice of the other, in that case, the other being white cis men, which is sort of an inversion of the way in which this dynamic of learning from the other is usually presented by, for example, white cis men learning from the queer of color practitioner. And then Deleuze and Guattari sort of, they worked earlier than Latour, and they sort of provided a theoretical basis for his work in formulating the concept of a rhizome as a sort of open field in which every point is connected to its other. So this idea of the dissolution of the boundary between self and other is really what's grounding my theorizations today. And they write that multiplicities are rhizomatic and expose arborescent pseudo-multiplicities for what they are. So what he's saying here about arborescence is you can visualize it almost as a tree structure in which self and other are fundamentally opposed to each other. But in opposition to that, or not really in opposition to that, an alternative to that, he's proposing, or the two of them are proposing the concept of a rhizome as a way of thinking about relationality that refuses those kinds of binary oppositions, that foreclose the possibilities of learning through the other that I sort of experienced in the Sangha, in the context of the Sangha. I sort of want to turn from Deleuze and Guattari to a Caribbean thinker named Edouard Glissant, who sort of rearticulates the rhizome in a post-colonial context. And in his book Poetics of Relation, he writes that thought draws the imaginary of the past, a knowledge becoming. One cannot stop it to assess it nor isolate it to transmit it. It is sharing one can never not retain, nor ever in standing still boast about. So here he's limbing out a kind of intersubjectivity within which the boundary between self and other is not only opposed, but also this process of becoming. So I read this almost as self becoming its other and the other becoming the self, this sort of dialectical relation between self and other, which he proposes in his framing of relation as a kind of totality in which this relationality never exhausts itself. And he writes that thought of the other is occasionally presupposed by dominant populations, but with an utterly sovereign power or proposed until it hurts by those under them who set themselves free. The other of thought is always set in motion by its confluences as a whole, in which each is changed by and changes the other. So in contrast to simply thinking of the other, which sort of enacts a reification or hypostasization of the other in the mind of the self, Edouard Glissant suggests that thinking about the other of thought, sort of the stranger of epistemology, you could frame it, that as a way of proposing an intersubjective engagement in which the relation between self and other is not foreclosed by any kinds of boundaries, and particularly the overdetermined boundaries instantiated within dominant colonial discursive regimes. So now I sort of want to suture my reflection on Edouard Glissant with the work of another theorist named Eve Sedgwick, who proposes a distinction between two sort of forms of reading, paranoid reading and reparative reading. So she sort of identifies or locates paranoid reading within a broad tradition of post-structuralism that seeks to uncover or to expose, to demystify, to subvert, to parody. So with these post-structuralist projects of demystification, and in contrast to that, she sort of imagines or dreams of another form of reading called reparative reading. And she writes that the desire of a reparative impulse is additive and accretive. Its fear is that the culture surrounding it is inimical to its nurture. It wants to assemble and confer plenitude on an object that will then have resources to offer to itself. So the reason why I think Sedgwick's theorization on reparative reading and paranoid reading is useful here, even though there are several problems with it or caveats that I'll discuss later, is that the idea of assembly, this notion that, or this question of how do we engage in communing with others in contexts that want to rip us apart from one another, and sort of thinking back on Glissant, how can we stage this sort of unfolding relationship between self and other in neoliberal context, in contexts that will mark us as individuals? So how do we enact a de-individualization by staging a kind of assembly? And so Eve Sedgwick's thinking on reparative reading is sort of, I guess, the grounds on which I begin asking questions about how queer of color practitioners sort of introduce new concepts of relationality. And she herself was actually drawn to Buddhism. She wrote an article called Pedagogy of Buddhism, in which she sort of limbs out another distinction between epistemology and phenomenology as sort of ways of thinking about the possibilities of relationality. She writes that simply to be with this teaching, or simply to be with knowledge, or simply to be with experience makes far more difference than would either believing it or disbelieving it. So rather than simply viewing experience from this paranoid perspective, she's thinking about reparative reading as a way of forging new possibilities of relationality. So I don't really want to spend too much time on this, but this is sort of one example of, this is kind of an epitome of paranoid reading in decolonial thought. Homi K. Baba's theorization of mimicry, which sort of looks at the ways in which colonized subjects sort of subvert the gaze of the colonizer by enacting a kind of differential repetition or a subversive repetition, a mockery of the colonizer's exercise of power. But this is the kind of thinking that I actually want to diverge from, and thinking about relationality and thinking about healing and thinking about an ethics of care as alternatives to this kind of paranoid insistence on demystification or subversion. So in pursuing alternatives to this kind of epistemological focus on paranoia, I'm turning to the concept of flesh, or specifically enfleshment, the ways in which marked bodies, brown bodies, are sort of violently turned into flesh, but also the ways in which flesh beings are sort of rendered, are forcibly rendered legible in dominant discursive regimes. So a thinker whose work has been important to me is Hortense Spillers, who sort of theorizes the ungendering of the Black body in the context of enslavement by inaugurating a distinction between body and flesh, flesh being sort of the pre-discursive stage upon which dominant discourses act. And in particular, she's thinking about the ungendering of the enslaved woman across the Middle Passage, the ways in which the enslaved woman is brutally not only given a sort of surplus array of nominatives, not only marked as, in fact, Black woman, but also the ways in which that figure is brutally transformed into flesh through acts of physical violence, through acts of psychological violence, and spiritual violence. But I'm thinking through flesh as an analytic that can help us think about the possibilities of cultivating liberation, and particularly liberation through the forging of assemblies among marked bodies, or bodies who sort of who do experience the sort of violent insistence of dominant colonial regimes. And I want to conclude by thinking through the work of two theorists who I read as sort of in a kind of lineage with Spillers. So the first is Christina Sharp, who in the wake writes, "First, if we are lucky, we live in the knowledge that the wake has positioned us as a no citizen. If we are lucky, the knowledge of this positioning avails us particular ways of re-seeing, re-inhabiting, and reimagining the world." So for me, I interpret this in sort of my autoethnography, thinking about the ways in which how can my own marking, how can my overdetermination as a queer brown person, particularly within these white spiritual contexts, how can that positionality actually offer me new ways of seeing, new ways of being, new ways of engaging with others? How, in other words, how can my own fleshly matter serve as a grounds for a decolonial politics of liberation that refuses the binary opposition of self and other? And I want to end by sort of ruminating on a line of inquiry instantiated by Sylvia Wynter, the problem of re-enchanted humanism. She writes that the problem that we confront can only be solved if we can, for the first time, experience ourselves not only as we do now, as this or that genre of human, but also as human. A new mode of experiencing ourselves in which every mode of being human, every form or life that has ever been enacted is a part of us, we a part of them. So this is a sort of troubling line of inquiry for me. It's this kind of vexed inquiry because she's proposing a kind of re-enchanted humanism, a new sort of capacious humanism as an alternative to the violent regimes of colonial modernity that would split the self from its other. But is the human the answer, or is there something else? Is there another grounds of being upon which we can ground our politics? In other words, is human as an analytic too overdetermined as a category? Is it always already embedded within colonial semiotic, within colonial semioses that would enact split between the self and other? Can the concept of enfleshment help us work beyond humanisms that would sort of not only not only enact a binary opposition between non-human and human, but really that fundamental opposition staging a wider split between the self and its other. And so this is sort of where I want to conclude my talk and thinking about how can queer of color Buddhist practitioners offer us alternative ways of thinking about humanism? Does humanism work? Has humanism exhausted itself? And how can the matter of flesh, or how can the flesh of the matter help us work out possibilities of colonial or decolonial liberation that are illegible in colonial contexts? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have questions and answers at the end altogether. Next, we have Dr. Amber Boyles of Sophia University. She's an adjunct faculty. And she's also a NAMA-approved Ayurvedic wellness counselor. So she has another take on a different methodology. And she's online.
Hello, thank you very much. Let me share my screen with everyone. So this has been a really wonderful conference, and I'm very grateful to be included, and I'm humbled to contribute to such an esteemed gathering of scholars. So thank you to the Harvard Divinity School for this space. So my name is Amber Boyles, and to introduce a research approach that emerged from the challenges imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Amber, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're not seeing your slides. Can you try sharing your screen again, please?
Of course.
Thank you.
That happened the first time too, when we checked it out. How's that?
Fabulous. Yeah, we see them now. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Perfect. So this is a research approach that, as I was just saying, emerged due to the challenges of COVID-19, which happened while I was about to commence my dissertation research. It's a novel method that not only allowed me to complete the research remotely, but it also unexpectedly paved the way for a deeper understanding of alternative spiritualities within Indigenous communities. So the title of my presentation is The Benefits of Surrogate Interviewers in Research with Indigenous Peoples, Fostering Cultural Appreciation. It is a topic that I could not find mentioned anywhere in the literature that I reviewed. And I'm just going to share a little bit with you about my journey that led me to it and the potential implications it holds for fostering cultural appreciation and ethical inquiry in scholarly research. So to begin, I just want to share a little bit of my own personal background that led me to this research topic. I was hesitant to share this piece, but I think it's pertinent, if only to let you know the kind of esoteric nature of the research. It doesn't have a framework in our Western comprehension, really, and so it became even more valuable to have a surrogate interviewer to help me bridge what is very common in an Indigenous setting and what's very uncommon in our Western setting. So in 2019, I went to it was 2016. I went to the Brazilian Amazon for the first time, and inspired by events that happened there, I began my dissertation work in my doctoral work in 2019, originally to explore the predictive nature of entheogenic plants and how they might activate intuition, especially while in a parasympathetic state. So what led me to the topic were several premonitory events that I had while I was there doing a spiritual study with elder Amazonian shaman Tata Yawanawa, seen here on the left of the screen, in both my dreams and while under the influence of ayahuasca, which is an entheogenic medicine containing the psychoactive compound dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. I encountered visions of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl at various ages and various stages of her life. And I came over the 30-day study to know this child as my daughter. I was also shown who the father was. It was a man who I met in kindergarten, but that I hadn't seen in over 13 years. 2 years later, I went to the Sacred Valley of Peru, and I was sitting with Wachuma, which is another entheogenic medicine, which is an Andean-grown cactus. And this contains the psychoactive compound of mescaline. And in this ceremony, I had another vision that was very abrupt and kind of shook me. It said that I was about to have this baby and I needed to prepare myself. So long story short, in 2021, I gave birth to this blonde-haired, blue-eyed child in my visions. And this ultimately guided my research to premonitions of pregnancy and the altered states of consciousness in which they might be possible. So all of that is to say that my journey culminated in a cross-cultural study involving both Western and Indigenous participants. The participants were from the Kagaba or Kogi and Iku or Owako, the Arhuaco communities in Northern Colombia, neither of whom use the entheogenic medicines, but they premonish deeply and they learn everything of their child to be via dreaming. So by examining both the Western enculturated individuals and the Indigenous peoples, the study highlighted a contrast between the absence of a supportive framework for premonitions in Western culture and their integrated significance within the Indigenous communities. However, back to the topic at hand, as I prepared to commence my research, the onset of the global pandemic posed unprecedented challenges. The most prescient was the restriction of travel. The Indigenous territories were very selective of who they were going to be letting in at this time, and it complicated the logistics of field work just incredibly beyond anything I could have expected. So heartbroken, I had always wanted to pursue a doctorate to do that field work in person. But amidst these challenges, I found myself grappling with this dilemma of, could I conduct research remotely? Was this an ethical approach? Not to mention, the compounded sort of complications of being a new mother, traveling into a remote and very unforgiving territory. So it was during this introspection that the concept of a surrogate interviewer emerged. And it was a notion really born out of necessity, and it was shaped by, I think, a sensitivity and a deep-seated commitment to ethical research practices. So drawing upon my prior connections with the region, I had spent some time there in 2018 and 2019, and I had befriended several people who were connected to these communities. I ultimately enlisted the support of a dear friend, a trusted midwife with profound ties to the Indigenous communities in question. So the surrogate interviewer is a Colombian native, and they played a pivotal role in facilitating this research process. The intimate knowledge of the communities that they had, the fluency in Spanish and English, along with profound familiarity with the participants and with their culture and their spirituality, bridged linguistic barriers, and it fostered an immediate trust. And by conducting the interviewers in person and providing these valuable cultural insights, the surrogate enabled what I think was a much more nuanced exploration of promontory experiences within Indigenous cultures. So I'm going to skip that frame. As I embarked on this unconventional research journey, I had so many questions. I didn't know whether I was going to call it surrogate interviewing, especially as it related to pregnancy. Did it confuse the matter? And after speaking with my committee, about this extensively, surrogate was the word that everybody felt was most aligned with what was happening. So, I just was very, I think, I was just very aware of the reputation, that she was putting her reputation on the line for this, the trust that these communities have in her was something that I was very sensitive to. So dialogue surrounding the dissemination of research findings, what might have been proprietary, what might we not want to share. There were things that were learned that I was asked not to share. And so there was a protection of the community interests, I think, that was respected, and these communications happened with transparency and sensitivity with everyone involved. I think it's absolutely imperative that researchers uphold the integrity of these partnerships and honor the trust placed in them by the Indigenous communities. So the utilization of a surrogate interviewer, as I said, yielded manifold benefits. It transcended the confines of the logistical constraints imposed on me by the pandemic. And it also allowed immediate access to the participants. And the enhanced trust facilitated a depth of understanding that would have been, I think, probably very challenging to achieve in a more traditional manner. For example, the surrogate interviewer was able to explain some of these extremely esoteric concepts that my Western acculturated mind would have otherwise had a very difficult time, comprehending or digesting. And I think moreover, because she had such a wonderful relationship with the communities, and she'd studied their spirituality for decades, and she'd been working, these were her friends. And so I think that this approach really underscored the importance of the cultural sensitivity and the reciprocity in Indigenous research, paving the way ultimately for a more inclusive and equitable research landscape. So I think, looking forward into future directions, I think as we reflect on the potential transformative, or the transformative potential, I should say, of using a surrogate interviewer in Indigenous research, it would be worthwhile to consider the future directions and avenues. So continued collaboration with Indigenous communities, coupled with ongoing dialogue and reflection, is essential in refining and advancing this methodology. I hope to use it again. I hope to see other people using it. I'd like to have a bigger conversation about it. It's very new. As I said, I didn't find it mentioned in the literature anywhere. I think it's also the efforts, perhaps to integrate surrogate interviewing into a broader research framework. It has to be accompanied by a commitment to ethical engagement, to cultural humility, and to be very sensitive about these things will be important. So my recommendation, born from this very distinctive experience, extends to future researchers, particularly to those of Western origin who are engaged with Indigenous research. Exploring the possibility of employing surrogate interviewers, I think, emerges as a viable strategy, whether that means you're befriending someone who is embedded in the community, if you are connecting with someone who's directly affiliated with the community, if you find someone fluent in languages who is part of that community directly. Well, I think that the selection of the surrogate would depend on all these specific circumstances. And they also might potentially present a solution to circumvent related cultural appropriation issues, which is another advantage. The dual advantages, of course, of conducting interviewers in person versus employing a surrogate become evident in this context, as someone with only a very basic understanding of Spanish working with the surrogate obviated the need for a translator. It streamlined the communication process. It allowed the research to be done in a timely manner. And furthermore, as I just covered, the immediate initiation of the interviewers really happened because of the trust that she already had established with the community, whereas, going in to do field work, it can take years and sometimes decades. I mean, truly, if we're honest, I think it could take lifetimes to establish a trust in which someone might feel open to sharing very profound spiritual concepts with you. And so, and also the travel can be cost prohibitive for some people. Some people aren't allowed or aren't able to do field work because of the cost of travel, especially nowadays. So beyond the logistical advantages, the method has implications for authenticity and purity of information shared. As I just touched on, implicit trust between the surrogate and the Indigenous participants fostered an environment where the insights were shared more openly, more profoundly. The absence of skepticism regarding motives enhanced the likelihood of receiving unfiltered and genuine narratives, contributing to a more profound understanding of these spiritual experiences within these particular communities. So in essence, the integration of surrogate interviewers into academic research, particularly when working with Indigenous communities, I think represents a potential methodological innovation It not only addresses practical challenges posed by circumstances such as the global pandemic in my case, but also it seeks to uphold principles of cultural sensitivity and ethical research practices. So as we are all here navigating these complexities of alternative spiritualities, I believe this approach emerges as a pathway to bridge cultural gaps and to forge meaningful connections in the pursuit of knowledge. And in conclusion, the utilization of surrogate interviewers represents a potential paradigm shift in Indigenous research, a testament to the resilience and the adaptability of scholarly inquiry in the face of adversity. So it's therefore my hope that, that we can embrace this approach as a potential pathway to cultural appreciation and to ethical inquiry, to meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities. So using this methodology, it might help us chart a course toward a future where research is guided by reciprocity, by respect, and to a deep-seated commitment to the pursuit of scholarly knowledge. So I thank you for your time and for your attention. And I just put my contact details here if anybody wanted to reach me directly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amber. So now we have three guests, three speakers. Dr. Fernanda Guevara, who is working to disseminate Indigenous cosmologies, especially in Brazil and the Amazon. And with her is one of the Yawanawa, who is a professor, the main professor, and he is 60 years old. And with him is a younger person, Yawanawa, who is the chief of Nova Esperanza, or New Hope, village of 300 people. So we have these three, and I'll let them take it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't have my co-authors here with me. Nani is, he had actually an accident, and he's in the hospital, unfortunately. And Iskukua was very busy and couldn't connect. But I want to link a little bit to Amber's presentation because they are from the Yawanawa people in Rio Gregorio, where she was, and the first picture that she showed is their home. So first I want to thank you so much for Harvard Divinity School and for the organizers. That's the third time I'm participating in the conference, and it feels really special to be part of this community, and even not presenting in person all of the times. I already feel part of this community. So thank you so much for this inspiring conference. So I'm gonna share my screen. And another thing I wanted to comment on Amber's presentation is that Nani, the professor, he was visiting Oxford University last year, and he was giving a talk there. And it was the first time they received him. And one of the people in the audience, after he was giving a talk, asked him, what would you like from the researchers that go to your land to do research? And then he said, I would like them to come back. And everybody was was very surprised and laughing as well. But for me, it tells a lot of what Amber was sharing about respect, trust, reciprocity. So for him, the most important thing was to see these people back, to have feedback from them on their research and so on. So this is an article I co-authored with them, and is response to the psychedelic Renaissance movement, and it questions what is medicine. So according to Oxford Languages Dictionary, medicine is the science or practice of the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease, a drug or other preparation for the treatment or prevention of disease, and a spell, a charm, or fetish believed to have healing, protective, and other powers. And according to the World Health Organization, traditional medicine has been defined as the sum total of the knowledge, skill, and practices based on the theories, beliefs, and experiences indigenous and other cultures, whether explicable or not, used in the maintenance of health, as well as in the prevention, diagnosis, improvement, or treatment of physical and mental illness. So we can see there are some common elements in these definitions, such as prevention, diagnosis, disease, treatment, and so on. And traditional medicines for the indigenous, for the Ojibwe-speaking indigenous people, they're the ones normally in North America. It's a language not commonly spoken by First Nations people from the US and Canada. The word for medicine is mashkiki, which means the strength of the earth. And this means that everything that comes from the earth, or it is offered by the earth, can be medicine, including us. And here I included this art from Lisa Boivin, because I think it's a representation of different realms of both clinical knowledge and traditional knowledge. And here is the glossary of the art. And I'm not going to look at every piece of it, but I found it very meaningful because besides giving a lot of important insights to clinical knowledge that are drawn from traditional knowledge, it also has a lot of common elements, which I'll talk about here in terms of the Amazonian ontologies, such as being open to embrace other ways of knowing and being in the world, the importance of chanting and dancing in the healing process, and the fact that we are walking this path together with all our differences. We still share the same house in the journey of life in Earth. So moving on to ayahuasca, which is the medicine I want to concentrate here. It is, ayahuasca is a Quechua word for translated normally as vine of the soul, and it refers to an Amazonian vine specifically named Bicaapi, and to a brew known also by other names such as Camarampi, Uni, Nishipai, Iagé, Daime, Vegetal, among many other names. And most of these names belong to Amazonian indigenous peoples that use ayahuasca, which nowadays are more than 160 groups. And the brew is prepared according to different recipes, and you can have up to at least 90 different potential plant additives to Bicaapi, but the most common are P. viridis and D. cabrerana. And P. viridis is also known as chacruna from the Quechua, which means to mix. And it is this species that contains DMT. And much like the classical psychedelics, ayahuasca use has been associated with a range of positive therapeutic outcomes, including the alleviation of depression and addictions. But a concept more directly related with indigenous people's practices is the one of medicine or master teaching spirit instead of molecule or psychedelic. So one important arena of the debates on ayahuasca is the Indigenous Conference of Ayahuasca, which has been happening now for 4 years, and it's going to happen in the Yawanawa land next year. And ayahuasca is illegal in many places. And we now have what has been called the ayahuasca diaspora, with many retreats happening both in the forest and all around the world, being organized by indigenous and non-indigenous people. We also have numerous patents on DMT that have been filled, as well as different trials to study it in startups and pharmaceutical companies. And the first medical grade drug candidate of ayahuasca is also being developed. So just to give an idea, there are many types of the brew depending on what is mixed and how it is brewed. The most used one is what is called the yellow ayahuasca, but indigenous people affirm that the different kinds have actually a variety of effects, and they may have different chemical compositions. And the botanical identification of all the varieties has not yet been possible, but the different kinds of ayahuasca and the different plants that they use have actually native names and classification given by indigenous people. So since I've begun to work with indigenous people, I have thought a lot about ceremony and ritual. All human societies have ceremony rituals, including religious rituals and sacraments, national rituals, seasonal festivals, and rites of passage in initiation, like the rituals of birth, marriage, death. And these are generally community and culturally based and follow normally a traditional formal pattern. And rituals normally imply a kind of continuity, a memory transmitted from past generations through the practice of the ritual itself, as they bring the past to the present. And I like very much the views of American anthropologist Gregory Bateson on rituals being a corrective function, allowing integration of narrow individual consciousness with the larger circuits of mental process, including collective and what he called the ecologies of mind. And in the light of Bateson's theories, psychoactive plants like ayahuasca can be seen as tools for blurring the ego boundaries between individuals and their larger social and ecological context. So ritual in this context is actually instrumental to foster self-transformation, while at the same time challenging the participants' own cultural constructs and basic assumptions about the world. And he also argued that Western epistemology perpetuates a system of understanding which is means to an end driven. And this actually narrows our perception of reality, limiting what comes into consciousness, and therefore limiting the amount of wisdom that can be generated from the perception. And he then argued for humility and acceptance of the natural system instead of the scientific arrogance in relation to it. And he believed that humility could come about only when we have the coupling of thought and emotion together to obtain knowledge. And here is where Bateson and indigenous beliefs actually intersect, because such understanding of humility is absolutely central to indigenous ontologies. And vital in understanding such ontologies is the understanding of animism, what have been called by anthropologists as perspective or multinaturalism. Once indigenous peoples are immersed in deep experiences with nature, they view and live the world as relational and animate. Humans are nature and vice versa. And they have deployed what has been called exuberant technologies of enchantment that reinforce connections with place and the beings of the place. They nurture a sense of humility, gratitude, and wonder at the contingency of life. And they perceive themselves as serving these other than human beings rather than the opposite, as we do normally. And for them, care is what provides the sustenance of diversity and abundance that is effective and embodied, as opposed to calculative and rational. And this means that different beings, human and other than humans, they come into being through their relations with others, what has been called relational ontology in social sciences. And for the Quechua-speaking people, for example, the individual is constantly becoming others, and people do not have a fixed identity. This transience and mutability is part of every being, including us. So just to give some examples of ayahuasca is understood by two different groups in the Amazon, the Huniquin and the Yawanawa. Both of them have been leading the spread of their culture around the world. So I think they are good examples to look at. And the Huniquin, they name ayahuasca Nishipai, as they believe it is the wire of enchantment. And for them, in everyday life, we can only see the ordinary sides of reality, the bodies and not the revealing, the more subtle aspects of the identity that is common to all living things, which they call Yushin. That could actually be translated as the spirit. Perceiving the Yushin that inhabit all living beings and recognizing them as Huniquin as well enables the perception of equality among all beings. For the Yawanawa, ayahuasca is the sacred vine. They name it as Yuni, and by doing so, they teach us about unity and how their constant rituals and journeys through Uni ensure that the relationship between humans and other than human beings is one of union, balance, and reciprocation. Meaning that humans never take more from other than humans than that which they can return, not just materially, but also in other levels, spiritually as well. And by that they do this reciprocal, they take these reciprocal actions with honor, gratitude, chants, prayer, they make offers. And according to Diana, taking uni is an opportunity to unite and expand the family. And here family refers to the extended family of humans and other than humans. And it is only as a result of this continual engagement that they are able to understand all there is and to know about the natural world. And I think you can see here in these images the jiboya, the boa constrictor, which is a very sacred animal to them. They see it as one of the first animals that came into the world and the one that has its whole body connected to the earth. And as such, the jiboya carries a lot of knowledge about the land and is one wise ancestor of ours. And so probably very different than what most of us here think about the boa constrictor, as we may be scared of it. But certainly similar to what our Greek ancestors once thought about the healing powers of the serpent, which actually became the main medicine. So moving on to traditional and scientific practice, while the traditional use of ayahuasca differs among different groups, the brew has been used mainly by shamans for healing, magic, divination, and social rituals. And one of the primary purposes is the diagnosis of illness, but also to help with different aspects of the community well-being. Chanting is a common element to most cultures who use it, and it is their form of praying and communicating with other than human beings. In Brazil, normally ayahuasca is widely used in communal ceremonies that involve dancing, singing, playing instruments. But in Peru, some traditional uses of ayahuasca, on the other hand, include ceremonies in the dark. And in many traditions, there is the use of feathers, burning resins, blowing tobacco, and using other medicines to create a safe, protected space and facilitate the healing process. In biomedical practice, however, there is a tendency to view ayahuasca as primarily a vehicle for making DMT orally active. While such a framing might allow for a smoother integration with Western medicine, it actually obscures the diversity of ayahuasca preparations, some even without DMT. And indeed, ayahuasca has a complex mechanism of action and the presence of more than one active constituent, which was considered by science, among other factors, an unusual challenge to the pharmacologists. And to overcome such a challenge, according to this biomedical idea, the ayahuasca that is most common in biomedical research is made exclusively by B. capi and P. varieties, but still is very difficult to reach this standardization of the brew. And normally the biomedical research had to employ its gold standard, the double blind design, where the variety of complex cultural, musical, social, ritual interactions can take place. And diets are also very important in different indigenous traditions. By combining the intake of plants with dietary restrictions, sexual abstinence, and social isolation, the medicines can work better in the body, but also through dreams and visions. This also contrasts heavily with the scientific explanatory model, where mind is paramount. In the Amazonian conceptions, the healing typically happens through the body, not through the mind. Just by thinking that it is the gut that processes ayahuasca, what some call our other brain, we could expand the understandings of how it acts. So what are the implications of all this? From an indigenous perspective, the reduction of ayahuasca to one compound, mainly DMT, to the detriment of the others, and the disregard of the traditional practices that are taken together with the brew generates what has been called epistemic injustice. And I prefer to call bioepistemicide, because there is an erasure of not only the knowledge, but also of the biological being as well. And biomedical studies approach the conclusion according to their own epistemic standards that ayahuasca indeed have therapeutical potentials, something that actually has been known and claimed by indigenous people for many, many years. Their traditional knowledge about it gets lost in time, while the Western objective and reductionist approach takes the stage, risking losing critical and important information about their traditions. And from a scientific perspective, it's still doubtful that the standardization of ayahuasca was ever achieved. And that there are many patients that report of their own experiences of disease and treatment, which can and should be studied with qualitative and phenomenological methods that normally are disregarded as soft evidence in favor of objective data, hard evidence. This can be really detrimental to the outcomes of the treatments as well. Yet when we are studying something like ayahuasca that is most entire subjectively felt, it is doubtful if objectivity can ever be achieved, especially when the treatment is aiming at people's feelings, emotions, thoughts. The brain is an open, complex system constantly in development and changing. So it is important to critically examine and understand these limits of the standard pharmacological approach. All this led to a movement among indigenous people to reclaim the ethics of psychedelic research, and they established what have been called the 8 R's: reverence, respect, responsibility, relevance, regulation, reparation, restoration, and reconciliation. And to conclude, I wonder who is blind in such a context. During all my career as a researcher, I used to work with climate change first and then reducing deforestation. And I would always spend a lot of time between the classrooms and the forest. And I will always learn more at the forest. And to me, the Amazonian shamans and people as a whole are great scientists. They are always looking for something. They have always been great observers and experimenters. The discovery of ayahuasca emerged not just as a gift from nature, as many of their myths narrate, but also as a result of their constant research and experimentation. So if we don't take this into consideration while studying ayahuasca, we risk decontextualizing traditional medicine and losing many of the important aspects of it. And healing is not just about the substance, as many of them claim. Our tendency to keep separating things, it's a result, again, of this extractive logic that we live in. And it's now the time to overcome such logic and include more collaborative methodologies, aiming at understanding all these different local ways of knowing. So to conclude, I believe it's very important to consider if we can first open our eyes to their scientific evidence as well. And Indigenous people need to have their rights recognized as well. And considering the high demand for treat millions of depressed patients with a potential economic market suppressing $200 billion in the US alone, the medicalization of ayahuasca needs an adequate regulation. And it's also important that biomedicine and psychiatry open themselves to the findings of anthropology, to the debates on health and disease in different cultural contexts, and to specific ethnomedical concepts as well. So we can better identify transcultural continuities and ontological equivocations. And this, again, involves cultural humility and questioning how we use our privileged positions as scientists. And also important to ask, what is science and who defines it and for what purposes and in whose interests? With the technology we have available today, there is this idea of bridging the different knowledges. But I think it's something that there are many intersections that we can try to understand. But again, it's very important to step outside of our rational thinking and the thinking that we know more than them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernanda. So we have one more with another different methodology. Tyler Shanaye. Huh?
Hello, everyone.
Well, let me introduce you. Okay. She works with integral somatic decolonizing feminism and relational education. And she's the mother of 2 young children, and she's a fellow alum from Women's Spirituality at California Institute of Integral Studies.
Hello, everyone. And yes, I want to first start with the thank you for the capacity in this space to be here. And I'm excited that I got to be in this session, hearing the research and the offerings that have already been presented. So thank you for that. And thank you for your attention to the presentation that I'm offering today on my recent doctoral research entitled Disruption, Reclamation, and Delight, a critical organic autoethnography of a Black mother's childbirth as liberatory transpersonal consciousness. And before I begin, I just want to be in acknowledgement of the Anishinaabe, whose lands I am an occupier of here in so-called northern Michigan, where I birthed both of my children and this particular doctorate. And I also want to honor the Massachusetts people who are holding my face on the screen and all of the connections that I'm feeling in my body, but don't get to be in person with, and just honoring those lands and those peoples. And in a prayer that what I offer here today is of service to our collective knowing of each other and ourselves in a better way. So let me just get my screen share going here. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting a study that examines childbirth, natural childbirth as an expanded state of consciousness, and suggests that in a supportive setting, a birthing person may experience forms of personal transformation that can result in healing from white supremacy, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism. And to get us oriented toward that inquiry, I'll first just introduce myself. So I'm Taylor Shanae. I'm a mother of two. I'm a queer, bicultural, Black, gender fluid person. I'm a scholar of somatic psychology and women's spirituality. And my research is anchored in a critical organic autoethnography of my first childbirth experience. So during my first pregnancy, which lasted 41 weeks and 4 days, I got inspired to understand the links between childbirth as an expanded state of consciousness and the larger understanding of mystical consciousness as I was preparing to give birth. And then during the 40-hour labor that I had to bring my first child here, I got to actually experience that state of consciousness. And during the first 32 hours of labor at home and unmedicated, I entered an intensely altered state of consciousness in which I heard voices, had visions, experienced profound alterations in space and in time, and transmuted existing perceptions of my identity. The multiple shifts in my perception of reality were vivid, all-consuming, profoundly transpersonal and transformative. And through this awareness, I came face to face with unseen spiritual realms, unshakable and humbling forces of nature, ancestral inheritances, my ego, and death. And the state of consciousness induced by the intensity and rhythmicity of a natural childbirth was, in a word, psychedelic. And I asked myself, how could this be? What is this state of consciousness that is induced by an unmedicated childbirth? And so it's this experience of childbirth that has guided me to what I present today. It's a birth story which is contextualized within the US birth cultural paradigm. And I analyze my own birth narrative to uncover how childbirth is a unique expanded state of consciousness that can support deep personal transformation and healing from systems of dominance. And more acutely, I articulate how childbirth bends time, reorganizes space, and expands perception, thus allowing for mystical experience. And so my experience in my childbirth experience, as well as my research, is backgrounded by the current maternal healthcare crisis. And currently we're experiencing childbirth as a highly managed medical event. Inside of colonial modernity, it has moved from the home and into the hospital, making childbirth and the babies that are born more a product of a medical colonial institution than an organic gestational human body. And under this context, we're seeing a crisis of care. And this doesn't even really begin to address the impacts of the abortion bans that have gone into effect around the country. And as reproductive care continues to become more and more restrictive, I imagine this crisis will only become more catastrophic. But to link us into some statistics, in 2021, the US maternal mortality rate was 32.9 deaths per 100,000 live births, with staggering racial disparities, anchoring non-Hispanic Black mothers experiencing 69.9 deaths per 100,000 live births, or 2.6 times the mortality rate of any other race. And this current cultural practice of medical birth associates Black maternity with the optics of hypermedicalization, mortality, as well as an increased postpartum morbidity, such as postpartum depression. And in a 2004, Cheryl Totano Beck was able to link routine medical birth with the onset of PTSD. And the study further indicated that mothers are at a higher risk if they have a pre-existing trauma history, which includes increased trauma exposure experienced by Black birthing people due to overt racism, bias, cultural exposure to racialized violence, and microaggressions. So as a Black birthing person birthing into this context, it was important for me to find to really understand and try to serve in addressing these disparities by examining one of the roots influences on modern medical birth, and then offer a remembering of natural childbirth as a unique psychospiritual state that can support personal healing from these systems of dominance. So it's a real windy approach that I took on, a rather novel approach to the research. First, I wanted to make sure that I was able to anchor us into the context of current medical birth culture. And so my literature review explores the cultural transformation of US birth practices from the home and the care of highly skilled and spiritually guided enslaved African midwives to the medical system. Because in order to effectively argue that natural childbirth may support healing from systems of dominance, I first have to contextualize modern medical childbirth practices as an extension of the colonial forces of white supremacy, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism. And this context provides insight into the childbirth landscape that dictates how people choose to give birth. And through it, I review literature from the reproductive justice movement, natural and home birth literature, midwifery studies, and medical birth outcomes, all of which highlight how white supremacy, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism have developed modern medical obstetric birth practices, ranging from the professionalization of birth out of midwifery into obstetrics, as well as the experimentation on enslaved Black birthing and laboring mothers to perfect obstetric procedures such as the cesarean birth. I then move into developing the theory of childbirth consciousness. And to do that, I conduct a theoretical comparative analysis through the use of birthing people would enter what would be considered an expanded state of consciousness during childbirth. And I developed this theory by highlighting parallels in the existing literature on transpersonal birth and psychedelics research to position natural childbirth as a relevant and unique psychospiritual state worthy of academic attention. And I anchor it to the psychedelics movement for three key reasons. Both experiences are immediate and time-bound. Both the natural birth movement and the psychedelics renaissance have modern roots in the counterculture of 1960s, but are actually ancient indigenous traditions in which a practitioner knew how to guide people between the worlds. And that these practitioners share a historical experience of state-sanctioned violence and eradication from Black and Indigenous communities under the guise of medicalization and professionalism. And so through the analysis, I uncover three key alterations to consciousness and three spiritual and transpersonal themes that are at the core of a natural and decolonized childbirth consciousness. So their changes in perceptions include changes in time or the transcendence of linear time. That's been identified as an indicator of mystical experience. And in birth, this is marked by the beginning of regular rhythmic contractions. The changes in space, which both refers to the actual physical space or setting, as well as the experience. And then this experience is marked by the arising of a specific inner spiritual or physical space. And then changes in perception. And in the literature, they're showing that birthing people often have been given a vision or being spoken to by an outside force in order to deal with labor pain. So through the machinations of changes in time, space, and perception, consciousness changes and expands in both childbirth and entheogens. And with these changes, there are various transformative themes that can emerge that lead to healing, namely a connection with the divine, a connection with nature, and an expanded sense of self, which I get to touch on in my own personal findings with my autoethnography. But the theme of connection to nature highlights how natural childbirth may be an extension of a birthing person's ecological identity, how it parallels other acts of environmental care, and how natural childbirth supports the continued development of an ecological self. Through a connection to the divine, the spiritual aspects of childbirth transform a person's way of knowing the divine more directly. Childbirth has been revered as a gateway experience to the divine through embodied revelations of God, spirit, or unity that are where the sacred becomes knowable through corporeality. And then finally, an expanded sense of self with these greater connections to the and nature potentiated to birth through birth seem to both directly and indirectly support a deepened and broadened sense of self that can have lasting impacts on a person's overall sense of well-being, specifically a sense of empowerment for the birthing person. So to test this theory, I developed and used a critical organic autoethnography methodology, a synthesis of the rites of passage structure and intentional use of liminality found in the feminist transpersonal approach of organic inquiry, with the self-referential in-depth analysis of critical autoethnography to use the account of my first childbirth experience as the primary data source. And this autoethnographic research explores the complete rite of passage of my first childbirth experience from pregnancy through postpartum. And I use the organic inquiry methodology to review artifacts from these 3 different phases, including birth photos, videos, and written narratives to reveal major themes and sub-themes. And I touch on, through my review, I touch on the original themes that were presented in the literature review. And after an emergency transfer to the hospital at 32 hours of labor, I also touch on how my themes changed once actually in the hospital setting. So to touch on the first way that childbirth consciousness expressed itself, I had a deepened connection to the divine, and that was facilitated through access to various presences that provided guidance, instruction, and encouragement during the birthing process. One was a change in perception with the involuntary auditory guidance and reflection from an unknown and unseeable presence. And I also had a change in perception and space, which was the involuntary visualization of liminal locations or places, feeling as though it had been transported to divine locations. A deepened sense of connection with nature, what came through the sense of belonging with others, both to human and more than human, that give birth as an aspect of life on this planet. And through that, I had a change in perception and space, which was the involuntary visualization or unrehearsed visualization of various animals giving birth, largely wild animals giving birth. I also had a change in perception of space and in perception where I had the involuntary visualization of major earth events, such as volcanic eruptions and hurricanes. And so through this, I was able to find myself in deeper connection with a sense of nature. And then I had an expanded sense of self, which became evident through the experience of both the sense of connection with the divine and nature. These connections revealed a transformed sense of self, including my interconnection with all other life. And so I had a change in perception, which was the immediate and undeniable sense of interconnection and belonging with all life-producing elements and participants on Earth, as well as a change in perception, which is a redefining kinship with the presence of other animals and their birthing process. Once transferred to the hospital, the setting directly and profoundly influenced my sense of consciousness themes and how I experienced things. The first was the impact of the white male gaze, which became a theme under the of influence once I transferred to the hospital, as I had the presence of a white male obstetric doctor who was attending me at the final stages of my labor. And the themes that emerged in that were a change in perception and time. I had a dual awareness suddenly of myself as a patient, as well as a force of nature that I had been connected to by being perceived through the white male gaze. I also had a change in my experience of time with the introduction of a clock and the influence of sense of external control over my birth experience. And then the final theme that emerged was the role of fear in the birthing experience, which predominantly showed up once in the hospital. And I experienced that in a change of perception and in time, which was a change in my support team's attitude. I experienced it as a change of time in my ability to remain in control of my body under the clock time of my attending doctor. And then I had a change in space in which I psychologically entered the bardo and lingered in a no place between birth and death. So taken together, my experience aligns with the theory that childbirth is a unique psychospiritual state of consciousness marked by changes in time, space, and perception that can support a deepened sense of connection to nature, the divine, and a sense of self. But to highlight how these experiences can support healing from systems of dominance, I concluded the research by sharing personal integrative practices of change to illustrate the theory that childbirth is transformative if we take it into consideration of what comes after. So from the critical organic autoethnographic account, my deepened connections to the divine, nature, and expanded sense of self have sustained, so changed over time, thanks in part to a commitment to a variety of integrative practices that emerged from my birth experience. And in the dissertation, I share 3 examples under the organic inquiry umbrella of change in the areas of spirit, self, and service. So a transformation of spirit has manifested through a commitment to ancestral healing practices, specifically with my Black lineages and departed through ritual unforgetting of familial Black dead. Transformative change towards spirit has manifested through a commitment to Haraway's notion of odd kin making and the remembering of myself as an ecological being related to the more than human world and dedicated to multi-species reproductive justice. And transformative change in the category of self has manifested through personal commitment to a more empowered and embodied sexuality and embracing creative impulse inherent in my femininity and femaleness. So in conclusion, childbirth under colonial modernity has become a hyper-medicalized product of culture that links trauma, fear, and white male control with the optics of human reproduction in a way that further justify medical surveillance and interference. Yet when birth is understood as an ancient lifeway and spiritual experience, and birthing people are left to experience the natural unfolding of childbirth consciousness, transformative spiritual experiences are potentiated that can serve deepened connections to the divine, nature, and an expanded sense of self that are antithetical to the ideologies upheld by colonial medical institutions. In the end, the autoethnographic account of my first childbirth experience highlights how childbirth consciousness deepens spiritual experiences, all of which influenced my beliefs and behaviors to support a felt sense of healing, from white supremacist, patriarchal, and anthropocentric ideologies. The critical organic autoethnographic account, alongside existing literature and theoretical comparative analysis, positions childbirth as an extraordinarily spiritual state of consciousness with significant implications for creating, maintaining, and transmuting cultural norms by empowering those that birth to act in accordance with their sense of autonomy and power. And finally, the research exemplifies how the setting of a childbirth experience, similar to that of an entheogenic experience, directly influences the birthing person's ability to access mystical awareness and can thus support or impede healing experiences. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the presenters. We have expanded the boundaries of methodologies. So it's time for questions and sure.
Hello, my question is for Taylor. Hi, Taylor. This is
Hello.
Kimberly.
I can tell your voice. Hi.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful job. Thank you. My question for you is, how do you, based upon your research and your own lived experience with birthing, would you or do you envision a new way of being in relationship with the experience that can be, for lack of better words, rolled out? And especially in particularly for Black and Brown women who are really struggling in these medical complexes during the birthing process. So kind of your thoughts on where do you see this can go and how we can start these shifts?
Thank you so much for the question. Oh, and I get to see the audience. How cute. That's sweet. Hey. Thank you for the question. And one of the things that I've been really sitting with, and this is existing, this is there's an entire decolonial birth movement, as well as a Black midwifery remembering and resurgence and education in the traditions and the practices, the inherited practices linked inside the culture to actually support people no longer having to go into colonial institutions, but actually having community-based midwifery programs or birthing institutions outside of the medical complex that can support actual anchoring into the importance of the set and setting that can help to liberate and create more free births. And so that's something that's been really exciting. It's a really big thing here in Michigan and in Detroit in particular, moving toward building one of the first Black midwifery schools and institutions here in the state of Michigan that can really support those birthing practices that relieve stress as well as and bias of actually entering into the medical institution, but that also uphold traditional practices, which includes not just how we deal with prenatal care, how we actually go through the birthing process, but then what does postpartum look like? What does postpartum care look like? What are the foods that have traditionally been healing among the African diaspora? And actually just allowing for the creation of culturally appropriate, not culturally appropriate, culturally anchored, culturally created, communally created birth practices that actually just exist outside of the institution of the medical system or in conjunction with it, as well as I think there is a longing for this conversation to just be more obvious about what are the disparities, and that it is not that Black and Brown people are at higher risk. It is that Black and Brown people suffer racism, and that it gets enacted inside of a medical system. It gets enacted through practices and ideologies that then take place inside, on top of, and through Black bodies. There is no inherent risk to giving birth as a Black person and as a Black woman. There is risk in doing so inside of a racist system that does not value your reproduction. And so I think that there's also my prayer is, how do we continue to welcome all of the Black midwives back, welcome all of the Indigenous Black midwives back? How do we actually create that space where our traditions, in the similar way that the ayahuasca was being attended to, right? Like that there's an intelligence here that we can't streamline birth in the way that the medical model seeks to do.
Thank you, Taylor. And really quickly, with postpartum, I mean, that's another huge area. Do you have any interest in doing any work around that? Because that is so huge. And
always. And there's so many amazing organizations that are really focused on traditional postpartum care and communal care. Actually, how do we create like community resources so that after a baby is born, someone doesn't have to go back to work the next day or 2 days later or 2 weeks later or 2 months later, but that there's actually the resources available for them to become a whole separate body again from the person that they've given birth to, which is anchored in traditional knowledge. Thank you.
So now, just a second, we got to take turns with our Zoom people, if there are any. Oh, no. She can go, no? Okay, I'll go do it. Okay, hi Taylor, good to see you. My question's actually for Amber. Amber, I really enjoyed your presentation and I learned something very new with this idea of surrogate interviewing, so thank you for that. But my question is, you spoke so well about the benefits in terms of the relationship building and the trust between the surrogate interviewer and the research participants. But I was wondering if you could also speak to maybe some of the risks or challenges, and how was it conveyed to the research participants, like who you were and your identity, in terms of like ensuring that that connection was still there, even though you weren't the one conducting the interviews. And then a second part to that is sort of also in line with what Fernanda talked about with the Indigenous research subjects wanting the researchers to come back, right? And so of course, in your case, you're not suggesting traveling at all, but which I get, but how do you then loop back into sharing the research findings with the research participants?
Thank you. Very good questions. Yeah, I talked a lot about the benefits and not about the limitations, which of course there would be many, one of which would be a very colonial approach to using an Indigenous person to do the work for you, which I think would be extremely detrimental. So in this case, it was a person who's a dear friend of mine. And she was able to communicate to them who I was, several of whom I had met when I was there in the previous years prior to the pandemic. So it wasn't that I had no relationship with them, but I didn't have a relationship with all of them. And, in the Kagaba, the Kogi and the Iku or Awako communities, it's historically, these are oral traditions. They in a sense, Alan Herrera, who is there, an anthropologist, maybe one of the most famous anthropologists in the area, more recently, it was quoted, and I'm paraphrasing, but that they essentially don't believe in literacy because it steals from you your ability to remember. I mean, this is a community this is a cosmology that tracks back pre-Columbus. This is one of the most ancient traditions that I've ever come across on the planet. And they're spiritual leaders who are called mamas or mamos, the male leaders, and the female leaders are the sahas. They, I have been told, can recite up to 500 of their ancestors generationally. I can think of I might be able to go back 5, 6, or 7. I mean, 500 is extraordinary. And so for them, literacy sort of steals from their ability to do this in their training. And so the permissions that were given were all oral. There were no papers signed. She was granted the permissions from the organizing bodies for this research to happen, which is something I would have had to have done if I were there. And in fact, the first time I went, I did go to the Kogi governor's office and sat for a day to see him, and then he had to leave. So this is a process that takes a long, long time. So yeah, so she was, her communicating to them about who I was and her trust in me allowed them to put trust in this process. And they were also very open and eager to share their experiences, which are incredibly beautiful. And to teach, and they wanted to teach outside of this concept of premonitions of pregnancy also, which is incredible. It's such an honor to learn from these ancient traditions of wisdom. And then, so that's the first piece. And what will you remind me of the second piece of the question?
It was about kind of circling back and sharing,
Yeah.
which is not going to be shared in research in written form, but
Yeah. So, this is something my chair and I talked a lot about because her doctoral work was with an Indigenous community. And, I would like to go back. I'd love to take my daughter there. And to Nani's point, I think we should go back. And I think it's important to have this reciprocity. And, I will say one other piece. I would like to share with them the results essentially. But there was another piece. There was a big project that they were working on at the time, and that my surrogate interviewer was very connected to. And so there was a financial exchange for this work in order to support that project. And so, and I don't know that it always has to be financial. There are some cultures that this would be an insult to, but in this particular instance, they needed some money to finish a school. And so I helped with that. It wasn't a huge sum of money, but it was significant, And so there's that exchange too. But I do want to go back. I do think that that's incredibly important. I am in continued communication with the surrogate interviewer about the results. I haven't published it on ProQuest yet, but I intend to. I just sort of got swept away with other projects. And so she would like to read it, and I've shared with her pieces of it. But I think that it will be really interesting to them to hear some of the pieces, like there is, I'm sure Taylor, that of Robbie Davis Floyd. So she was on my committee actually. Some of the things that I learned from her, I think I would love to share with them, because there is this biomedicalization that's happening in a Western context that I think is absolutely detrimental. So I mean, I think, I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was great. And I also just want to say, I loved how all the presentations complemented each other on this session.
I was just wanting to say, like, what a true joy to be with everyone, all these beautiful ladies today, and how three of us had an ethnographic approach to our research was also very interesting. And this piece about the ayahuasca being, pharmaceuticalized, if that's even a word, is just incredibly prescient on my mind right now. So I'm very grateful for your research too. Fernanda, that was beautiful.
Any other questions? Yeah. Good.
This question is a little bit more for Amber and Fernanda. Taylor, I know you spoke not only about your own research, but also about because it was kind of somewhat autobiographical, your own goals for what, or rather shared goals for what changes kind of need to be made in order to ensure that people have not only more equitable but liberatory childbirth experiences. And so for Amber and Fernanda, I'm wondering for those you've been working with, I know that the interview and co-creative processes of writing often result in a lot of knowledge and understanding of folks' intentions that don't always make it into the papers and published results. And so I'm wondering if there's any of those that you feel would be important to share with audiences, or rather that perhaps research collaborators and interview participants would particularly want for us to know. For example, I know that a number of Kogi mamas have been doing a lot of advocacy around climate and environmental issues quite intentionally. And so I'm quite curious about the surrounding motivations of folks who you've been working with and what they might like us to know. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe can I start, Amber?
Yeah, please, since I spoke.
Yes, great, thank you.
thank you for your question. Yeah, the whole, in my case, the whole psychedelic movement alone was actually the main trigger for them to speak out. I mean, and they are doing it again in different ways, with the Indigenous conference on ayahuasca that emerged exactly because they were not being invited to be in the international conferences that were talking about the topic. And one of these conferences was in Brazil at some point, 2016, if I'm not mistaken, or 13. And then they started the process of organizing themselves in their conference. That in the beginning was actually not open at all to non-Indigenous people. It was just this place that they would discuss what was happening, and they would come up with some requests in terms of how to guide. And this is published actually in the site of the conference. There are like 4 letters coming out of the conferences where they say what they want in terms of this whole pharmaceutical move. But this article specifically was because I was already working with Nani, the main professor nowadays of the Awanawa. And then he said, you know, like, can you write these things? And he wants me, and actually there is a Portuguese version of the article, and we are working in maybe illustrating it and making less scientific, so their youth can also have access to it. And in the case of the other authors, Kukua, he's one of the main youth leaders nowadays, and they are again hosting the next conference, and their feeling was that they need to be more and more seen as, you know, as sort of like, not scientists, I'm not even know if that's the right word for it, but as knowledge keepers as we are. And there are many of them nowadays that are doing their PhDs, are writing books, mostly in Portuguese, but some of them, even Skukwa, he just learned English. So they really kind of like want to put their voice out there more and more. And I think because, again, of my relationship with them, that was actually easy in a sense that I didn't need to sort of like go there, introduce myself, and it was something that came organically. And this was very, very good because, again, the trust thing is very important.
Yeah, we you know, when I went to do the diet with Tata in 2016, we were invited to make a documentary about him, and we've just finished it 8 years later. And one of the reasons when we asked, like, why now, they said we really have to share ourselves to save ourselves. And that really resonated with me. Like, now's the time to share ourselves to save ourselves. And I feel that that's similar in the Kogi territory too, because they are famously private. And it wasn't until Alan Herrera, who was a BBC journalist, went in the 90s and to do a documentary about them that we saw or heard from them at all. And I think now this idea of like being in a meta crisis or a poly crisis, like currently, globally with so many things happening, now is the time to learn from them. And now is the time to be open to receiving a new way of being in relationship to the life that is around us. And I think they feel that too. And I think that if you watch, for example, the documentaries that Alan made, there are 2 of them, he went back later, they share pretty specifically about why they're now open to sharing. And because there's not a lot of time left to sort of course correct. So I think that this is really vital for, you know, the rest of us sort of Western enculturated population to be open to learning to receive. You know, in California, they had, you know, I lived in California for most of my adult life. I don't live there anymore, but there were severe wildfires. You know, it would rain ashes on my car driving down the road at some point. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that they even started to talk to the indigenous communities about how to do controlled burns, about how they were able to avoid these sort of things in the past. And so I think that that dialogue being open now gives me a lot of hope. I also think that there is a sort of another energy that's sort of creating all this technology to block the sun and to seed clouds and to sort of technologically get ourselves out of what's a technological crisis. And I think we can't fix the problem with what broke it in the first place. And so we really need to go back to these ancient technologies, ancient methodologies. And so I think that this is one of the reasons. When you asked the question, I did think of one thing, and I did write about it in the dissertation, so I feel free to share it. You know, you read a lot about the mamas and the mamos and the Kogi and Arhuaco traditions, and you don't hear anything about the females. You know, I've been watching the conference a little bit on and off, and I just coincidentally happened upon a few sessions that were very male. And so to be here with these women is really beautiful, because I asked the surrogate, I said, why is it that you don't, you know, why is it that you don't read or hear anything about the women, the Sahas? And she said, because the women are the great secret of everything, and we have to protect them. And I thought that was so beautiful. Like this, they're the ones that are really holding it together, you know? And we have lived historically, at least in the last several generations, centuries, in a very male dominant, or we can say sort of masculine energy. And the feminine energy is coming back, you know? And it's not about the feminine energy taking over, it's about finding this equilibrium, you know? So I think it's a very beautiful time to be having these kinds of open dialogues with people who are the carriers of indigenous wisdom, particularly the elders, because we're losing them every day, and with them we're losing languages. Nani's, you know, one of like 3 people who still can speak fluent Yawanawa. It's like we're just losing languages every day, and I think it's really vital that we listen to them while they still are alive.
Thanks. Do you have a short question? We just have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, I can make it a short question. I actually have 2, and we'll see which one is the shorter of the 2. My first question is for Fernanda. I was really interested in what you said about the diversity in the different kinds of ayahuasca preparations. And I was curious, within the communities that you were working with, if those were seen more primarily as how we see it in the West, as a sort of just homogeneous concept of ayahuasca, if they were seen as more distinct kinds of medicines. And then my second question is for Taylor. I was very struck by Amber's consideration of intuition, and I was wondering if your choice to experience your birth in something that might be considered less conventional, if that was an intuitive decision for you or a more political decision, a more intentional kind of decision.
Okay, let me just check if I got your question right. You want to understand how they view the different mixtures in terms of how we view them, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm curious I guess maybe I'll put it this way. I guess I had just considered ayahuasca to be this one thing. So I assume that's maybe not how they think of it.
No, not at all. They're like, and actually, again, there are some recipes that are done just with the bikapi, just with the vine, you know, and not with DMT. Like in the past, especially, you know, they started doing it mostly with the vine, and in terms of the different plants that you can mix to the vine. And even the vine, there are many different species, you know, like the many different species. and the different plants that you can mix, the ones that contain the DMT. I think like probably every group has a different one, you know, even the Yawanawa, they tell that the one that they have there, what they call kawa, no one has, you know, it's just like them. They never seen it in other group, and it's like their kawa, you know, their plant. So yeah, it's very different, and the way they brew as well, you know, can vary from group to group. Like some groups brew it twice, so you get like a thicker mixture, a stronger one. The Yawanawa normally they brew it, and their medicine is a bit like thinner and lighter, you know, it's not that heavy as well. So yeah, there are many differences, and they I mean, if you ask them, they are gonna tell you the name of every species. They are gonna teach you, like, you know, it's like crazy. I mean, much more than probably than an ethnobotanic would know if they go there. You know, it's just amazing how they know every different plant.
Did you have a question?
I had a question, but we're outside.
Is it short? You want to say it?
Hello. I know we're at time, so I'll try to be quick. This question is for, if I pronounce it correctly, is it Samir? So you mentioned Lama Rod Owens, and I had a pleasure of being in retreat with them several times, and I do think that they sort of created a rupture in the American Buddhist world and really allowed space for queer of color critique. And in your notion of, I guess, what you conceptualize as onto epistemology for yourself, I'm curious as to what you maybe think that Lama Rod Owen's contributions have been to onto epistemology, especially in relation to like the American Buddhist world. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think he's operating in a very racialized context, certainly in a neoliberal context. And I think that what he's doing specifically, I mean, he identifies himself as a Black with a Southern tweed. And I think that that's significant because he's sort of accepting the fullness of his various identities, his intersecting identities within a context that would, I mean, it's kind of interesting the way that Buddhism sort of migrated to the United States. Now it's dominated by like largely white male practitioners. So for him to be able to claim his identities in that context, he's sort of forging new grammars for liberation, I think, that would have been rendered invisible in that racialized and classed context that he's operating in. I think that the other thing that he's doing in sort of creating communities of queer of color practitioners, he's sort of moving past individuated notions of enlightenment and pursuing identity-based forms of liberation that are predicated on the formation of collectives or assemblies. So I think that sort of ties in with my theorizing on the distinction between body and flesh, sort of claiming that abjection and thinking about queerness, thinking about racialization, not only as, well, I mean, obviously they're destructive operations in themselves, to be marked as a Black person or as a brown person, but to take that enfleshment as a basis for forging new vocabularies and new grammars for liberation outside of the dominant racialized colonial discourses, that there's some possibility in abjection, in other words.
So I want to thank our audience for participating so much and our 4 presenters. Stop recording.